Hey guys, today we want to introduce two new stats for your HUD. The first stat is the effective stack. So what is the effective stack? If a bounty is involved and a player with, let's say, 20 big blinds is jamming and you're considering if you can call or not, his 20 big blinds are essentially lowered to a lower stack size because of the influence of the bounty. So a 20 big blind jam is, for example, only a 15 big blind jam effective because of the influence of the bounty. We have already the calculation of the bounty into chips and then add this to the pot, and then you get new pot odds, so you get new equity needed, and this equity will of course always be lower compared to the pot odds without a bounty. And so you can say that the stack which is jamming is effectively a bit lower because the odds are getting better. Now the whole calculations are done with EV calculations, so we are not using the in-game odds method, we are using the EV calculations, so the comparison of actions. The second stat is the equity drop caused by the bounty. So this is more or less a negative risk premium, where you can see the equity drop or the less equity needed compared to the pot odds caused by the bounty. So let's kick off with the problematic which those two stats should solve. So the problematic is pretty simple. The calculation of odds in game when a bounty is involved in the head will take some time. And if you are multi-tabling, so if you are playing, for example, more than 4 tables, let's say you're playing 10 or 15 tables, this can be very challenging. So you have a lot of situations where you have to make good decisions, you have to think about a lot of stuff. In which stage is the tournament, the stats of the player, how the stats will affect the player's, for example, open jamming range, and how big is his bounty, what is my future EV on the table, and so on and so on. And on top of this, you have to do the calculation of the bounty into chips, add this to the pot, get new odds, then make your decision based on your new equity. And there mustn't be only one situation at the same time. You can have like 2 situations or 3 situations at different tables at the same time, and then the calculation and the decision making will be very challenging. So the new 2 stats should help you to make your decision more accurate and faster, so that you can think about all the other things which might be important. Also, beside the calculation, another effect has to be taken into account, and this is that the size of the bounty compared to the stack value has a huge influence on the resulting equities, for example, for calling off an all-in. So if you are facing a 20 big blind jam of a player which has 1 starting bounty but 4 starting stacks, then the equity will be totally different compared to the situation where the player is jamming 20 big blinds which are 4 starting stacks but he has 4 starting bounties. So the resulting equities will be totally different, and let's look at this a bit more in detail. So when we do our studying, our observation is that when we are comparing situations with different stack sizes but similar effective stack sizes, we will notice that the equities which we will need to call off an all-in will differ. I'll give you 2 examples. So in this tabular, you can see in this column the bounty, and in this line here the effective stack sizes. And the big blind in this case should be 1/10 of a starting stack. If we take the PokerStar starting stack 5000 for example, then the big blind would be 500, then the small blind would be 250, and the ante would be 60. And of course, since this is not the starting big blind in the tournament, a bit of the bounty prize pool should be already been distributed out, because some players should be already busted at big blind 500, so we consider that 80% of the bounty prize pool is left. Now I give you a second situation where we have the same effective stack sizes, so 28, 25, 22.5 and 20 big blinds, and we have the same amount of bounties which can be won. And in this situation, the big blind should be 1/3 of a starting stack. So if we compare this again to PokerStars 5,000 starting stack, then this should be around about 1,600, 800 and an ante of, let's say, 200. Of course, in this situation, the tournament has already progressed a bit more compared to this situation, so even less of the bounty prize pool should be left. Now in red here are the chips for the effective stack sizes. So in this situation we have 20 big blinds effective. Here the big blind should be 500, so 500 times 20 is 10,000. So we have 2 starting stacks in this situation. In this situation here we have an effective stack of 20 big blinds, which is divided by 3, 6.66, and if we multiply 6.66 by 5,000, then we get 33,333. So let's say we could just directly transfer the chips into dollars, then this stack would be worth, of course, way less than this stack, although they have the same effective stack size. So let's say this stack would be worth around about $180 and this stack would be worth around about $500, $550. If we are now looking at the needed equities, we take, for example, here the 20 big blind effective, and the player should have 2 starting bounties. So in this case, a player with 20 big blinds effective and 2 starting bounties jams, we need 40.5% equity to call off the all-in versus his all-in jamming range. If we take the same situation a bit further progressed inside of the tournament, again the player has 20 big blinds effective and 2 starting bounties, then we need 43.9% equity to call off versus his all-in jamming range. And this is a difference of more than 3%, so this calling range will be totally different from this calling range here. And we will have to take this into account when we make in-game decisions. Let us drive this a bit further and look at how big the equity drop in those 2 situations is. So on the left side, again, the same situation which we had before, the 1/10 of a starting stack and 80% bounty price pool left. So in this case, 500, 250 and 60 the blinds. On the right side, we have again the 1/3 of a starting stack, so 1,600, 800 and let's say 200 ante are the blinds, and we have 60% of the bounty price pool left. And I have introduced a color coding here. So red would be lower than 3% equity drop, yellow would be in between 3 and 8% equity drop, and green would be in between 8 and 50% equity drop. So what is the equity drop? We are getting certain pot odds in game, and caused by the bounty, we will get a bit better odds because the bounty has also some value. So the equities which are stated here are the equities which you actually will need to call off the all-in. So those equities are already the final calculated equities considering the bounty involved. And now we just compare this to the given odds if we had no bounty involved, and then we get a certain equity drop. So let's compare again the 20 big blind effective jam with the 2 bounties involved. In this case, we are already in the yellow area, so we are in between 3 and 8% equity drop. So we can see from the number this should be in between 5 and 6% equity drop here. And if we take the same situation in a tournament where the tournament has already progressed a bit more, the equity drop is lower than 3% here. So not only that the equity drop difference between those 2 situations is more than 3%, you need 3% equity more here to call off the all-in. Also the equity drop compared to the odds is way lower in this situation where the tournament has progressed a bit more. So you need round about 46% equity in both cases if you are not considering the bounty, and the drop here is only 2.1% compared to the drop here, which is round about 5.5%. Out of those 2 observations, we can draw some very intuitive but important conclusions. So the first conclusion is that if you have to risk several starting stacks to win just 1 or 2 starting bounties, the deal is not very good. And so the equity drop caused by the bounty is not very big. So if you're looking at this tabular again, if you can only win very little bounties, but you have to risk, for example, here 2 starting stacks to win 1 starting bounty, then the deal is not very good and the equity drop is not very big. If you can win several bounties, the required equity will drop substantially. So if you can win 3 start bounties and still have to risk 2 starting stacks, then the equity drop will be already bigger than 8%. If you have to risk 1 starting stack to win 1 starting bounty, you're a lot of the times in the middle of the range of the equity drop, so in between 3 and 8%. If you have to risk 0.5 starting stacks to win 1 starting bounty or 1 starting stack to win 2 starting bounties, you're a lot of the times in the very high range of the equity drop, so bigger than 8%. If you have to risk 2 starting stacks to win 1 start bounty or 4 starting stacks to win 2 start bounties and so on, you're a lot of the times in the very low range of the equity drop. So the influence of the bounty is not very big. The mandatory equity drive comes from the stack value. So the investment of stack or the investment in stack value is way bigger than what you can win from the bounty, and so the equity doesn't drop as much. Now I will show you some verification calculations in HRC and compare this to our effective stack size calculation. This is what you will in the end see in your HUD. So what you got in this tabular, you got the stack size of the all-in jamming player or of the rejamming player, or in the end of the player which you want to call off or rejam on, and this player has a certain bounty size. And a stack size of, for example, 28 big blinds is effectively, if he has 1 start bounty, only a jam of effectively 16 big blinds. Or let's take another example, the 16 big blind open jam, if he has 2 starting bounties, is only an effective jam of 7 big blinds if you would compare this to a tournament which has no bounties involved. And now I'll show you some verification calculations. It's only screenshots because the setup in HRC takes a bit of time, but I've already calculated this for a lot of situations in all the tabulars, and I give you just some random screenshots with the calculations I've made. So for example, for the 16 big blind jam and the 2 starting bounties, if we look at the range which we can call off the all-in versus a player who jams 16 big blinds and has 2 bounties in the big blind, we have a range of 54.8%. So we have the bottom columns of Queen 5 offsuit, 9-8 offsuit, Jack 3 suited, 5-4 suited, all the pairs. Now, if we want to compare this to a tournament where is no bounty involved, we did say that the effective stack size is 7 big blinds. So we did the calculation for the effective 7 big blind jam in a non-KO tournament, which would be here, and you can see that the range is totally consistent. So I just switch in between the 2 screenshots. Here is the bounty calculation with 2 starting bounties and a 16 big blind jam. So the player jams 8,000 here. You can see this here, player jams 8,000. And in this calculation, the player jams 3,500, and we have the same range. Let's take another pre-calculated example where we had 1/3 of a starting stack. So here we got a stack size, and I did calculate for the 28 big blind open jam of a player who had 1 starting bounty, and this should be in calling range comparable to a player in a non-KO tournament who jams 22 big blinds. And let's verify this. So this is the 28 big blind jam of a player who has 1 starting bounty, and we are calling 18.9% in this case. If we compare this to a non-KO tournament where a player jams 22 big blinds, then we are calling again 18.7%. So if you compare the 2 ranges, they are looking totally similar. And this is essentially what the stat gives you. So if you know your calling ranges in a non-KO tournament versus a certain stack size, so in this case, if you know what you call versus a 22 big blind open jam from the button in the big blind, then you also know what you can call versus a 28 big blind open jam in the KO tournament where the player has one bounty. You also can say you know what you can rejam versus a 28 big blind player who is open raising the button. Of course, you can rejam a bit more because it will have some fall equity, but you will at least know all the bottom combos which you can jam. So this is what the stat is giving you. You don't have to rethink everything for a bounty tournament. You know your calling ranges, you know your rejamming ranges in a non-KO tournament, and now you just open inside of your head your tabulas, you look inside of your situation. So a 20 big blind player is open jamming from, let's say, the cutoff you're sitting in the big blind, he is 1.5 starting bounties. Then you know, okay, I call versus this player like I would call in a non-KO tournament when the player would jam 15 big blinds. And there I know, okay, I can call, for example, Queen Jack suited. So versus the player who jams 20 big blind and has 1.5 starting bounties, we would call now like we would call in a non-KO tournament when the player would jam 15 big blinds. And for example, if the player would jam, let's say from the cutoff, we are sitting in the big blind and facing the 15 big blind jam in the non-KO tournament, we would call a range which looks like this. So we now know we can call like King 10 suited, Queen Jack suited, King Jack offsuit, and so on. So if you know your calling ranges in a non-KO tournament, you now know your calling ranges in a KO tournament as well, using those tabulas which are provided inside of the HUD now. Let's look at an example hand here. So this is a hand out of $200 proc on Party Poker, and we're sitting in a big blind having Jack-8 suited. The player out of MP3 or of the hijack is jamming his roughly 21 big blind, and we want to decide whether we can call his all-in jam. And now we just open our pop-up and go to the first pop-up, which is 1 divided by 50 of a starting stack. So the starting stack was 100k. The blind size is 2,300, so this is round about 1/50 of a starting stack. It's a bit bigger, so we want to be inside of the range of those two pop-ups. This would be 1/20 of a starting stack. This is of course way too big, but it gives us the idea of how much more the effective stack would be if the blinds would be bigger. And let's just shortly do this. So he is jamming 21 big blinds, and we are looking into our first pop-up. So we are in between the 22.5 big blind and the 20 big blind jam of a player who has 1.5 starting bounties. So his effective jam size should be in between 5 and 4 big blinds. We can also look at the scenario where the player only has one starting bounty. In this case, we will have effective a 6 big blind open jam. And since the blinds are a bit bigger, we are looking shortly in this pop-up, and here we can see, okay, we could increase his effective stack size since the blinds are a bit bigger to probably 7 big blinds effective open jam. So now we would just call in-game what we would call against a 7 big blind open jam out of this position with a certain range when no KO would be involved, and we should match a very accurate calling range. Let's verify this in HRC. So this is the scenario where the player Knack is best is jamming his 21 big blinds and has one starting bounty, and in this case we did say that the effective stack size for one starting bounty and his effective stack size should be in between 6 and 7 big blind effective open jam. We can call this when a bounty is involved. So this calculation is for the bounty. Here we got a table equity and we did the MTT ICM calculation. And now we compare this to the cheap EV case in a non-KO tournament where the player is effectively jamming, in this case, 7 big blinds. And we are comparing the calling ranges in the big blind against the same jamming range. So he has here the 16% jamming range and here he has the 16% jamming range. And when we compare the calling ranges out of the big blind, this would be our calling range in the non-KO tournament versus a 7 big blind all-in open. And this will be our calling range against the 21 big blind open jam in the KO case where 1 bounty is involved, and you can see those two ranges are matching pretty well. Now the player had in this case 1.5 starting bounties, so we can again go inside of our pop-up and we can look it up in between 22.5 and 20 big blinds for 1.5 starting bounties. The player has effectively in between 4 and 5 big blinds, and if we look up the next blind size which is provided here in the pop-up, it would be in between 7 and 8 big blinds. So the average should be, I think, round about 5 big blind effective open jam. And if we now look it up again in HRC, first KO case, so player again is jamming the same range like before, but now he has 1.5 starting bounties instead of 1 starting bounty. In this case, we can call 38.5% of our range. And if we compare this to the chip EV case where the player again jams his 16%, but now has only 5 big blinds effective, then we can call 39.4%. And if we compare both ranges again, we can see those ranges are matching pretty well. So depending on the bounty size of the player, we have now a very easy tool where we can just look up, okay, this is in between 4 and 5 big blinds effective. What I want to call against this jamming range inside of a non-KO tournament from a tightish player in a regular tournament, well, okay, it's around about 40%, and Jack 8 suited is clearly inside. So we did end up calling here, and he did make 2 pair in the end. Now let's do a second example hand. This hand is out of the Bounty Builder 109, and we got Ace-8 suited under the gun +1. The player in the small blind did elect to overcall, and the big blind is jamming. So for our effective stack size analysis, it's not important that this player is in the hand. And just pretend that this player was folding pre-flop. So I did elect to ISO jam here in game and the player did fold. But for the analysis, I just pretend this player is not in the hand and I just face the 12 big blind rejam out of the big blind. So what I want to call after I did open raise against a 12 big blind rejam out of the big blind, which has 1 starting bounty. I go again inside of my effective stack size pop-up, and this time we have a blind size of 1,400. The starting stack in this tournament is 5,000, so we are round about at 1/4 of a starting stack. So we go to the big blind to starting stack ratio of 1/4, and he is jamming his 12 big blinds. And let's say he had 1 starting bounty, then his effective jamming size is 10 big blind in a non-KO tournament. So now I would call against this range what I would call against a 10 big blind rejam, which has the same jamming range like in the KO tournament. And let's look up the spot in HRC. So this is the spot where we open raise under the gun, the big blind, Tincher is jamming, and we have to elect what we want to call. Of course, he's very shallow, so we will call all of our opening range, but we want to compare this versus a non-KO tournament, and if the effective stack size, which we have calculated, is also valid in the non-KO case, so if the ranges are matching. And for the bounty case, the player is rejamming 17.5%, and we are calling all of our opening range. Now we did calculate the spot again for the non-KO case, so this is just a GPV calculation. And here we are opening the same range like before, so the 20.8%. The player in the big blind is rejamming the same, 17.5%, like he's rejamming here. And in this case, we also call all of our opening range. So the calling range is matching in both cases, and the approximation of the effective stack for the non-KO case compared to the stack where a bounty is involved is also valid. So now you can just in-game for all kinds of situations use the pop-up, look up the effective stack size. First, look at the blind size. So in this case, again, for 1,400, which is round about 1/4 of a starting stack, you go inside of your tabular. Then you look, okay, he has 12 big blinds, so you go here. Then you look, okay, how much bounties does he have? 1, 1.5, 2, and then you get the effective stack size. And then you can decide what you want to call against this effective stack size. In a non-KO tournament, you should actually know all your calling ranges in a non-KO tournament versus certain rejam sizes versus certain open jamming sizes. And I think this will very much help you to make faster and more accurate in-game decisions. I want to end this video with a quick explanation how to set up the stat in HRC, and I want to show you the second pop-up. So probably more for studying and not so much for in-game usage, but you can use this in-game. Of course, I'm using this in-game, is the equity drop tab. So not only that you can have effective stack sizes, if you like to work more with equities and then an effective equity drop and then getting out of the new equity your calling range, you can do this. So in this case, if he's jamming here, we are getting 1.72 to 1 odds, so 37% equity. And since one bounty is involved, we can now go to the equity drop tabular. We go to the correct pop-up, so the 1/4 of a starting stack. Then he is jamming 12 big blinds. He has one starting bounty, so we can decrease another 2% out of our giving equity given by the odds. So we don't need 37% to call off the all-in, but we need 35% to call off the all-in given by the equity drop pop-up, which we will provide also. So again, this is here, right? And now I want to show you how to set up both pop-ups inside of your Poker Tracker HUD. So this is the HUD which I am using with some mouse over panels, and this is more or less the classic HUD which is provided by the Poker Tracker when you buy the program. And now I'll show you how to set up those two pop-ups inside of your HUD. And for this, we will just create a new test HUD. So you go to HUD, edit HUD profiles, and then we just create a new HUD for this example. So we call this new HUD 3, and this should be a tournament HUD. And when you create a new HUD, then the groups are empty. And I create this new HUD just to show you how to implement this. Of course, in the end, the adding of the pop-ups to your already existing HUD will be the same. So this is my existing HUD, and I just add 2 more groups. But for the example, I will take the new HUD and just add a group. So I add a new group. I call this effective stack size. And I take out the separator, and this should only be shown to hero. So you don't want to have this panel for all of the players on a table. You don't need the panel like 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 times. Just have this panel once on the table is totally sufficient. So you can show this for hero only. And now we want to assign pop-ups to this group. For now, there are no pop-ups available, so we have to get those pop-ups. And how we get those pop-ups? Well, we go here to pop-up groups, and we have already created this. So you import the groups here, and you will have a folder where all of the Poker Tracker for HUD groups are already inside. So we take the already existing groups here, and I just shortly import this. So 3 groups should be sufficient for your start. The names are too long for me. You can do this as you like. I just changed the names shortly to a shorter name. So we are done with this. We have imported the 3 groups. Now we go back to the table groups, and now we can assign the pop-ups to the effective stack size. So we just add now the pop-ups in the right order which we want. So 1/3, 1/6, 1/4, and 1/3. And then we want to have something to click on it. So we add here with the plus, we add a text. I call this effective stack size as well. And problem in Pocket Tracker is that you need to have one stat to have this kind of text shown inside of your HUD. So if you would now set this up, click apply, okay, nothing will show on your HUD. You have to add one statistic here. And because we don't want to have an additional statistic like code format or something, there is a stat which shows nothing, and this is the blank stat. This is a custom stat created by a user. We will provide this inside of the zip file which you get, and you just add this blank stat to your panel here. And now you're already good to go. So you click apply, you click OK. So we just reopen the hand again, just open here the hand. Now the HUD is the HUD which I usually use, but we shortly change this to our new HUD which we just have created. And here you got now the effective stack size. Let me pull this over. And here you got the 3 pop-ups already inside. And now you would just add all the rest of the pop-ups, and you got all the pop-ups inside of your HUD. You do the same for the equity drop if you want to have this additionally on the table. It works the same way. So you're going to HUD, edit HUD profiles. Then you would add to your already existing HUD the new groups. This time we will call this like equity drop. Again, the separator goes out and hero only. And then we would assign pop-ups to this. And here we would now import the equity drop pop-ups. So for example, the 1/3 and 1/6. And we go back to the table groups. Now we go to the equity drop. We will assign those 2 pop-ups. So the equity drop 1/3 and the equity drop of 1/6. Then we will again add some text. So in this case, we would call this like equity drop. And we would again add the blank statistics. So it's shown inside of our HUD. We can search for the custom stats, and then for the blank stat again, just add this and click apply. And then if we look it up again in our HUD, so let's just take the same hand again and change the profile to our new HUD, which we have just created. Then now it's underneath it. Yeah, it's hidden. So here's the new equity drop panel now, and the 2 groups which we have imported are also inside of your HUD. That's essentially it. So pretty easy to set up. Just add the new groups to your already existing HUD, add the new pop-ups to your already existing HUD, assign those pop-ups to the right groups, and then you're good to go. Let's end this video with a little summary and some side notes. So you have now an easy and fast way to measure the influence of the bounty in-game by an effective stack size drop of your opponent's stack. So the bounty has some value, your opponent jams a certain stack size, you go inside of your new pop-up, you look up the correct situation, so you look at the stack size of your opponent and the current blind size, and you translate the current blind size to a part of a starting stack. So for example, if the blinds are 1,500 and 100 and the starting stack was 5,000, then you have an effective blind size of 1/5 of a starting stack. And then you just search for the right situation inside of the pop-up, and you know your opponent's effective jam size. So little side note here, all calculations were made for the GPV cases with the tool and the sitting in the big blind situation. So we had to take some reference point, and we took the sitting in the big blind situation as the reference point to calculate all the equities and then the equity drops, and then out of this the effective stack sizes. Of course, in game there will be more situations, but the difference between the equity drop of, let's say, a rejam and an open jam is not that big. You're probably then in +1 big blind effective stack size compared to the tabula, or -1 big blind effective stack size compared to the tabula. So if it's shown 7, then you're probably in the 8 big blind effective stack size or 6 big blind effective stack size, but the difference is not very big. We plan for the future to add some more effective blind sizes. So for now, we should have captured all the situations which occur before the money is reached. After the money is reached, there is little ICM influence, but the regular price pool is dropping, and for those cases we still have to make the calculations. So the plan is later on to have some more big blind sizes which are already in the money and very little ICM effect is considered. So I hope you enjoy those new 2 stats. Have fun using them in game. See you at the tables, guys, and bye bye.